Good morning. I wanted to start on time, especially because we'd like to make this an interactive dialogue. We want to have time for the audience to be engaged. Today we have a side event called Truthful Engagement in Real, Effective and Ethical Climate Action for an Ambitious Global Stocktake. And perhaps we should say more truthful. We all have our different versions of truth, but we're trying to give a space to talk about what could we be doing more effectively, ethically, and equitably and urgently that we may not be doing, and why. Our hosts today are a group of amazing organizations. I'd like to start with FAWCO, which is for women's empowerment. And then we have a number of Quaker organizations, the Friends World Committee for Consultation, the Quaker Earthcare Witness, Quaker United Nations Office, and Quakers in Britain. And in that sense of Quakerism, we would like to start just with a moment of silence to center ourselves in this space and in our work today. Thank you. We are aware of the many people not in this room and the many beings, including nature, and the most vulnerable and the poorest who are not here, and we uphold them. So I'm going to give you a quick run of show. Today we're going to have a brief outline of what we're doing. I'm going to then ask you to talk to each other briefly. And then we have 6 speakers, but I've been very strict. I'm asking them to only speak for 4 minutes each, max. And I'm asking them to speak personally. And I'm asking them to talk about what is their work, how do they see challenges for that more urgent and truthful and ethical and effective and real climate action, and then to leave with one suggestion of a way forward. And then we're going to open up and engage the audience in ways that you also see your stories. And we've handed out these little post-its because we hope that we can make a collage afterward of suggestions that you have, including suggestions who are people online in the audience. So today, to start, can you just turn to the person next to you and say, why did you come to this particular side event? And if you're far away from someone, do move next to them. Great. I'm going to bring you down again, if you can wrap up slowly. So for those of you just coming in, we just had a moment where everybody turned to their next door person to explain why they came to this particular side event. Before we start, I will just share why we actually called the side event why we did. And it's a personal story. I'm Lindsey. I'm with the Quaker United Nations Office, the representative for the human impacts of climate change. And for over a decade, we have been involved here in this space, but also in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, as quite active observers, as well as the Human Rights Council. And we have been supporting the IPCC with their 6th assessment report over the last years and their summary for policymakers. And in the last negotiation or approval session, in the synthesis report, in the incoming final government draft, we had a sentence that was perhaps the most inspiring sentence I have seen in our work. And the scientists confirm in a high confidence this sentence. urgent, feasible, and equitable near-term options are available at scale to address climate change and improve human well-being and planetary health. When we got the draft on the floor, the sentence was taken out. We brought together a range of states, both developed and developing, who called for that to come in. We had a range of observers calling for that sentence to be called in as one of the most inspiring messages that we can take home. And what we were left with was a sentence that was feasible, effective, and low-cost options for mitigation and adaptation are already available. What in that room, for whatever political reasons, fear reasons, psychological reasons, whatever within the states, were not able to bring back the words urgent, equitable, and available at scale. And those words are in different parts of the report, but they were not in that one sentence that was so powerful. And it really struck me to say, what is it that holds us back in our own lives, in our communities, in our regions, with our national governments, and in this room, to be able to uphold that urgent, real, effective, ethical, equitable action that can be done now? Because there are many challenges facing that, but some of them are about power and money, some of them are about other things, and today we're going to hear from our different panelists who come from very different parts of work, what they're seeing in their lives. Several challenges that they see often stop us from doing everything that we could be doing now. And many of the things we could be doing now would create a much healthier world, a more equitable world, a world that our children could live in and thrive in. So I'm going to start first with our panelist, Lili, who is one of the observers with me in the IPCC, and who helped with some of the language to strengthen on the concerns that we had. Lili is the director of the Center for International Environmental Law's Fossil Economy Program. And I turn now to Lili.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. Good morning, everyone. So in our Fossil Economy Program, which is a fairly new program internally at the Center for International Environmental Law, but the work within that program has been going on for a long time, we really focus on stopping false solution, closing escape hatches, closing loopholes for the inevitable transition away from fossil fuels. And we do that because we realize as we put more pressure on the fossil fuel industry, they're seeking those escape hatches to not transition. And those escape hatches are, moving into petrochemicals and, using CCS, claiming, carbon removal will save us, we can geoengineer our climate, those kinds of things. And we do that because not because we want to do it, because we have to do it to make space for real solutions. So that's really where my work sits within the Center for International Environmental Law. And we see this focus on false solutions from the industry really as a new denialism. So while we can no longer, ignore the real impacts of climate change, it is impossible to ignore that and deny that. It is still possible to, claim that we can engineer our way out of the crisis. So techno fixes are really the new denialism that we're seeing, and that's what we're fighting. So why is it so difficult to move forward, really? And I want to just name two things that I've seen in the work I've been doing in this space for a long time now. Is one thing has to do with how we frame a problem, because how we frame a problem really defines how we go about finding solutions. And there is a long history of, I would call it a history of forgotten alternatives in this space. Back in 1992, when we decided climate change was a problem with, something very abstract out there in the atmosphere, emissions. We did not define it as as being about, fossil fuels in the ground, or about extractivism, or about, all of the other root causes that we can now name. But we had a very narrow understanding of the problem, enshrined in this very convention. And then we took further, steps to narrow a vision of potential futures and solutions by claiming, emissions from fossil fuels were going to be fungible with, emissions captured in trees and soil. And we're at the, a next level of that narrowing. and taking sort of wrong turns and forgetting alternatives by thinking that we can fix the problem later by withdrawing and removing carbon from the atmosphere at a very large scale, or by redefining the problem as something to do with, levels of radiative forcing and saying that we can solar geoengineer our way out of this crisis. The other big thing that really worries me, and it makes me angry and also sad, is the question of what is negotiable. So I'm often sitting in meetings and conversations where people talk about hard to abate sectors. That's your new buzzword. Yeah, everything is hard to abate. What does that really mean? I mean, it means that we're saying our lifestyles in the global north that are, based on overconsumption and very resource intensive, they're not negotiable. Like, we cannot transition away from that lifestyle and that particular economic system. That is non-negotiable. But by doing that, we're putting people's life at risk, at harm, and, people are getting killed because of that. So, yeah, it's always a question of what is negotiable. And that makes me really, but it's being discussed as a very technical problem here. It's not being discussed as a political choice that we have. And I'll finish just by saying sort of what can help. So really the one thing I want to point out is that we need to turn this around, I think, in our thinking and say what we need is, we need to be realistic, yes, but we need radical realism. So the kinds of solutions that we're trying to get, the real solutions, the one embedded in a sentence that you read out, those are the realistic options, like the geoengineering and the CCS and, the carbon removal, and all of that is completely unrealistic. That's a world that we cannot imagine. I cannot imagine that world, but I can imagine that better world. So if we claim that that is actually radically realistic and the rest is just, crazy, I think we can maybe have a different conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lili. And one thing that I hadn't brought up was that in the synthesis report, one of the things that we as observers were pushing for was actually to get some of the risk language into the synthesis report. For example, on some of the geoengineering, which was not actually in the synthesis report. It was in the main text, but not in that summary. And we were able to get, for example, the risks for CCS in, but as a footnote. So you can see the need to try to uphold what is healthy now, what would be risks in the future, why isn't it there? I'm turning now to Kay Harrison. Kay is the head of delegation for New Zealand. I've known Kay for a number of years now. And another way that I know Kay is not only here, but because New Zealand has what I have seen, at least in my range of experience, a really unusual way of engaging with citizens to hear what they want and what they want their negotiators to be standing for when they come to the negotiations. And I asked Kay if she could come not only as a negotiator here, but also what it's like to be in her own country trying to engage with communities there. Thank you, Kay.
Thank you, Lindsey. Thank you very much. And thank you to the organisations who've brought us together today. First, I need to say apologies. I'll have to duck out just before 11. And thank you for these questions, Lindsey. You're very good at questions. That first question is, what delays real, effective, ethical climate action? And here for me, it's all about the tragedy of horizons. That we are, as human beings, preoccupied with short-term actions and short-term demands, even though if we used our biggest brains, we would know that pleasing ourselves in the present is at the expense of the future. It's irrational, actually. It's irrational. What is truthful engagement? Well, truthful engagement, as you were saying from the start there, Lindsey, is science. It's listening to the science, but it's also listening to it hopefully. And I think it's just unbelievable that our people in the IPCC would want to shout down a hopeful message because hope is critical. But also, I think for truthful engagement, you need to take responsibility for yourself, including acknowledging hurt and harm. And that is very difficult for some parties and people because they think somehow that's going to come with some great kind of liability or compensation bill. But in fact, as human beings, we must acknowledge the hurt and the harm. So in closing then too, the thing to take away, what encourages honest narrative? Listening. But it's really open, visible listening that you do with your whole body and your mind and your heart. And it should be kind of like, you know, anyone can see somebody who is really listening, because it will be visible and powerful. And that hopefully will lead to empathy and the ability to suspend yourself when you are interacting with others. In the indigenous language of my country, in Māori, there's an expression, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa, which means send out love and receive it, and it unites us. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. And thank you also for not only our Indigenous wisdom, but also connecting that with acknowledging the hurt and the harm in the room and the listening. And just to share, again, with the IPCC, the scientists have the strong statement that we loved. It was the states, certain states, that felt uncomfortable. And I just wanted to highlight that because I know our scientists have worked really hard to get this in, and they can say no to certain suggestions from states. But if it's scientifically acceptable, there is the pressure in the summary report to change language as long as it doesn't compromise the science. And so the question is the courage of our political leaders as well to hold that inspiration and to listen, as you say. Thank you so much, Kay, and for staying. Our next speaker is zooming in from India. Our next speaker is Bhavya George, who is with the Keystone Foundation and working with poorer communities. She's the program coordinator in climate change and works at the intersection of climate and gender. Bhavya, thank you so much for coming in, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Lindsey, and it's my honor to be present, though I'm virtually there. Hope my voice is audible properly. As you said in the beginning, that obviously there is some space missing out for certain people, like especially the poor and the vulnerable, and I'm glad that UNFCCC, along with other organizations, in making space, at least to virtually, for people who work with them to represent their voices in these forums. And I think when it comes to the question of how to make climate action ethical, real, and effective, one of the ways that we have chosen as a field-based organization is to really work on the leadership and the capacity building of the communities. One, on the individualistic sides, we do have climate historians whom we consider more important because of their traditional knowledge and the perceptions that they bring into the the forum and the discussion pathways of the climate change that we speak on a very global level. We do have the seed keepers, the native nursery holders. So they are the ones who kind of help us take this moves forward. And other than that, we also focus a lot on collectivism, which is very important, and it's amazing. And in that way, we look into the community foundation spaces and the women collectives who all come together and discuss their issues, the stories of resilience. So this is some, ways that we have figured out in 30 years of our experience on ground to kind of capture the ideas and the voice from people. And going way forward, we do have a lot of challenges that comes in, though we say, we are on the ground. So one of the challenge that we feel is very much linked with, the awareness and the local governance institutions. As you said, the IPCC reports, I can read it, but how to take that, and embody it in the ground and get that feedback back into the global space. I think that linkages and the transformation space is something I feel is a very challenging task. And also another thing is, how do we include the knowledge systems that's there, down there? I could still remember my walks with a lot of these village elders and the traditional healers, especially women, where they fluently speak about each and every thing on their way in the forest, and there is a story hidden, and it speaks of so many climate indicators that comes out of it. But how do we capture it and then bring out into the policy forums? So that's a challenge that we have faced in our work, and though we are working a long way, including advocacy as a main tool, but that still forms as a biggest challenge that we feel. But as we say, there is always like way forwards, and I think one of the way forward and a call that I want to give out is the space, especially for the marginalized communities, not as a victim. That is where we all mostly in any of the, if it's a disaster is happening, if there is an issue in the climate, they hold the space as a victim, but there is a need to transform that, and where they hold the space as a negotiator, they hold space as a collaborator, as a partner. And that's where the things change, especially women, where their voice is heard in these spaces. And in that way, they can bring out their experiences and talk about their own issues and their own perspectives, and bring this local lens into this global issue of climate change. And with that call, I say thanks. Vanakkam, Nandri.
Bhavya, thank you so much for being, and I hope you can stay with us until the end of the session. Empowering leaders, collectivism, challenging the knowledge system, but also giving the space and having voices heard. Upholding this as we move to our next speaker, who is Neil Grant. And Neil is with Climate Analytics. And Neil works on climate and energy analyst at Climate Analytics, but focuses also on decarbonization and rapid reduction of fossil fuels. Neil, I move to you.
Thank you, Lindsey. So at Climate Analytics, the work that I do is about mapping out realistic and achievable targets that align with 1.5 degrees and can help guide the global energy transition. I think that's really important because it can help us hold governments accountable in delivering the real scale of change that we need. And so, for example, we've just published some new analysis today that uses the latest global pathways filtered for feasibility and sustainability constraints. And that analysis finds that fossil fuel production needs to fall 40% over this decade. That's a 6% year-by-year cut from 2022 onwards. In terms of the challenges that I see in delaying real, effective and ethical climate action, I think a huge challenge is that we're still swimming in stories of delay. I think Lili spoke really well that sort of, delay is the new denialism. And I mean, my work is very data-driven, but I think, to me, truth is about science, truth is about data, but truth is also about stories. As humans, we're not data-driven creatures, we're story-driven creatures. And I think one of the big stories which is out there at the moment and is louder than ever is the idea that fossil fuels can continue to play a significant role, even in a low-carbon future. This is obviously based on the idea that CCS can address the issue of fossil fuel emissions and is particularly loud this year, as we have a COP hosted by a major oil and gas producer. We're seeing again and again CCS being used as a justification for continued fossil fuel extraction. I've just come from a press conference where I was fencing with certain delegates from certain countries around this issue, and it's not a truthful story. CCS may have a small role to play in some limited circumstances, for example, around cement, but it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for the fossil industry. So again, our latest analysis from today, we see CCS providing only 0.1% of global power generation in 2030 and under 1% by 2050. So fossil fuel use does need to start falling fast and start falling now. I think this story that the fossil lobby is telling is aided by their misuse of global pathways and misuse of data. So, I've seen ExxonMobil using the IPCC's database to suggest that gas use doesn't need to fall by 2050, which is, it's mind-boggling, but it's definitely not truthful use of the science. And so I think that's something that we really need to try and address and counter these stories of delay wherever we see them. In terms of what I think encourages honest narratives, I guess I'd want to acknowledge that there is a lot of honest voices already out there communicating that really truthful story about climate action, from young people, from campaigners, from faith groups. And so I guess as well as think about how we can be more truthful, I want to celebrate the truth-telling that is already happening. I remember, and I think we need to remember that so many of our decision makers hear those false stories so much more than they hear the truthful stories. In the UK in 2021, ministers met with fossil firms 9 times as often as they met with clean energy firms. So there's still this huge disconnect in terms of the story which is in the corridors of power and the story which is being shared at the ground. I guess for me personally, I've not been in this game very long. I don't have a lot of my own experience in terms of how we speak truth in climate action. But I guess to me, one of the truths that I feel is most important is what we need to do today to tackle climate action. We talk a lot about 2030. People want to talk a lot about 2050, and those numbers are important, but they don't help me think about what the world needs to do today. The number of times I hear politicians claim to be aligned with 1.5 by referencing their long-term goal when their current actions are completely out of line it's just really, really frustrating. So I guess personally, the story that I'm trying to tell as much as possible is not just what needs to happen by 2050 or 2030, but what needs to happen today. How much does fossil production need to fall this year? What does that mean for the industry's decision-making this year? I think that, to me, is an important part of telling the truth around climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you so much for that and for that overview, directly, specifically with the fossil fuel and some of the statistics you've given. That's quite helpful, and we'll have some questions, I'm sure, for more. I want to move now to Kate Dooley. And Kate is with the University of Melbourne. She's a research fellow there. She focuses on the intersection of policy around climate and biodiversity. She is one of the lead authors of the Land Report. And I welcome you, Kate, here. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Lindsey, and it's a pleasure to be here. So, yes, as Lindsey said, my research at the university is focused on land and sort of broadly equitable and just transitions in the land sector to contribute to climate change. Before I was at the university, I actually worked with an NGO in Brussels and that focuses on forest governance and land rights. And I was following the RED negotiations, if people aren't familiar with that, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, which were a set of negotiations over about 10 years to agree a policy incentive under the UNFCCC. And my work was really about trying to get this policy incentive to address forest governance and to be focused on securing land tenure, because there's so much evidence that they are the best ways to reduce and halt deforestation. But in fact, the whole RED outcome, probably unsurprisingly, because it's under the UNFCCC, was very, very focused on carbon. So in the end, forests are valued for their carbon, and this doesn't really work. We haven't actually seen a lot of emission reduction, of deforestation reduction from RED. Anyway, so I'm going to tell this as a bit of a story of how I got to the work I'm doing now. So then I left that work and went to do a PhD at the University of Melbourne, and my idea there was to focus on the upcoming negotiations for the Paris Agreement to see how RED, problematic accounting mechanism for forests, along with LULUCF, another problematic accounting mechanism that Annex 1 countries use, where they can potentially offset emission reductions from forests with increasing emissions in fossil fuels. At least that's what Australia does, not all countries. Anyway, so I wanted to see how this whole sort of forest and land came together in the Paris Agreement and how it was addressed, and how the rules around it were perhaps improved, how we could restrict the use of forests in offsetting fossil emissions. And what we got in the Paris Agreement was Article 4.1, where we're balancing sources of emissions with sinks, and this became widely interpreted as net zero, and now every government and corporation on the planet wants to reach net zero, which can and is in a lot of instances, particularly from corporations, being used as effectively a grand illusion that we can continue emitting fossil fuels as long as these are offset by uptake in land sinks and forests. There's no scientific basis to that. It's not true. Net zero, as it is sort of modelled in the Working Group 1 of the IPCC, is mostly about emission reductions. Emissions reduce 80 to 90%, and there's a small amount of residual emissions, largely from the agriculture sector, that can be feasibly offset with natural sinks. So this is very frustrating, because what it's also done is obscure the scale of the challenge. Like the scale of the pace and urgency of fossil fuel reductions get obscured in this language around net zero. Governments can say they're online for 1.5 degrees because they have distant net zero targets that are quite meaningless. In terms of how we get around this challenge and ways forward, Lindsey asked for one way forward, which is very difficult. I mean, I think we need to be understanding the relative level of reducing emissions versus any removals that make up net zero. It's much more about the zero than about the net. And then in terms of land sector, I just want to quickly say, sort of back to that earlier work around forest governance and ending deforestation. So there's a lot of hype now around nature-based solutions and how nature can contribute to climate change. And in fact, in terms of sequestration, in terms of growing trees or tree planting, there's a bit of a tree planting frenzy. It can't. It doesn't actually. I've published some work showing that removing carbon into the land sector is just dwarfed by the scale of our emissions. It has no impact on the 1.5 degree goal. It does slightly lower temperature by 1/10 of a degree by the end of the century. But for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, the only lever we really have is phasing out fossil fuels, and this decade. So anyway, what I want to say about that is where the land sector can really contribute is in ending deforestation, because there are also emissions that need to be phased out, and this decade. And perhaps a small story of hope to finish on is that in Victoria, the state of Victoria, in Australia, where I'm based, the state government just recently announced that they would end native forest logging by the end of this year. It had previously been a 2030 target. So that is fantastic. We shouldn't be native forest logging. Australia's a leading country in terms of deforestation, and now there's a conversation and pressure to apply this federally. So I still think ending deforestation is one of our big challenges we need to address.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I'm going to hold that ending deforestation, but I also wanted to uphold what you said, that net zero can obscure the scale of the challenge. And it's striking how language of net zero seems to do that in the mind without people actually understanding what it means. And in the Paris Agreement, we don't have the phrase net zero. And so that's often forgotten. One last thing I also wanted to raise is that sinks can become source. The IPCC will show that after a certain temperature rise, forests burn greater and greater, and it's not discussed. So when we talk about sinks and source, we don't actually talk about the collapse of the ecosystems, and that's another side of that truthful engagement. And I really appreciate you being here. Thank you. Our last speaker today is Gina Cortes, and Gina is the project manager for Climate at Women, engaging for a common future and co-focal point for women and gender constituency at the UNFCCC. Gina, thank you for being our last speaker, and you have this beautiful energy, and thank you for being here to finish.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I think that to frame a little bit on the questions, I would like to share some experiences built on part of what our work at the Women and Gender Constituency is, and it's about building that collective power. We are home of a network of more than 700 feminist, women-led gender organizations, and building collective power, new voices in this space is something very crucial for us. And a way that we build up that collective power is constructively collaborating and building up different actions, different work together across constituencies, across movements, across coalitions. So one of the things that I would like to make us reflect on is based on an experience that I particularly had last year in Egypt while organizing. I don't know if you might recall, if you have been there, you might have heard about it in the news, but it was the People's March. The People's March now is a moment of building that collective power to bring all people from different nationalities, languages together in a same space. People is speaking up out loud, chanting together, and you can feel your skin vibrating when seeing all these souls harmonizing in symphony. And although we have done our best to make a lineup of different speakers representing the different constituencies, genders, languages, regions, there was one person from the crowd that was shouting, that was really kind of shouting, kind of against of it, kind of very angry about it. And this person kind of slowly approached the people, the speakers that were standing a little bit higher, and was like, challenging the people there and challenging and asking why they were not included and so on. And I was in the audience, kind of in the backstage, because I was trying to make these things safe. So I just ran to him to stop him, because we have to be very careful with the security things now to keep on engaging on actions. And I stand to him and I look him to the eyes and I told him, "What's wrong? What is happening?" And he just looked me to the eyes with anger, like, "We are not being represented, the voices of my country." It's like, "You are doing this, like blaming us." And he was like, "It's not against us that you need to be like pushing that anger. We are together in this. We need to be reflecting on those people that are in this moment in the negotiation rooms perpetuating this anger. It's not with us, brother. We are together on this. We are trying to give, like a collective voice here. It's not against us." And then we kept on looking to the eyes, and he just started crying and crying and crying, and started crying together, and we were just hugging. But in that exchange of sides and hugging and crying, for me, it was so understandable, the collective trauma in which we are. A collective trauma that has been built through centuries based on colonial and extractive patterns of an imperialist model of development, an imported model of development that has been written as it should be the north of our compass. So my invitation that has been a challenge, because it's a challenge for us to build power in such scenarios. It is challenging for us to build power in a scenario of fear, in a scenario of surveillance, of intimidation, as what we have experienced in the last COP, as what we might be experiencing in the next COP. Those threats for civic space are very dangerous, as risking, our power to build this collective power. And the way that we can change it is by listening us. I think I resonate with the words of the delegate, like listening to us with empathy, but getting uncomfortable into those conversations, anti-colonial conversations that can lead us to understand the root causes of the system. Otherwise, we're just going to be cycling in an infinite cycle of perpetuation of those systems. Now we are talking about coal, fossil fuel phase out, but we are going to be talking in the future about lithium. We are going to be talking about this solar radiation management. So how we can change the system by having those uncomfortable conversations and listening each other. Thanks.
Thank you, Gina. And I just want to uphold some of what's been said, to repeat again, this collective trauma. I think we all have a collective trauma in our different ways. And the collective trauma, the imperious model of development, the grow, grow, grow. And also talking about the root causes. The root causes is the phrase that we ground ourselves in when we talk about truthful engagement. What are the root causes and why are we avoiding them? And then change the system. Kay had to leave for the negotiations, but what I'm going to ask you to do now is you've got a Post-it hold on to your Post-it, because when you leave, could you write something before you leave on your Post-it that is a way forward from your experience? And we're going to just, as you come out, just put those Post-its on the window, because we're going to create a collage. But while you're talking now, we're going to start taking notes and creating a collage of what you're saying, both your stories and ways forward that you see. So I want you just to turn to the person next to you again and say, what stood out to you? Just stretch a minute, speak to the person next to you. What stood out to you and what you've heard, and what do you want to ask? Because we're going to open up for questions in a minute. I want to draw you back. I want to see if you can bring some of those questions into the room. And I think we have a microphone at the back. If somebody can help us with the microphone. Who would like to start with a question for the panel, a story to share, a way forward? Let's have a brave hand. Then if we don't have a question right away, can I turn to the panel and ask if you have anything that you'd like to pick up, or reach out to one of the other panelists who said something that you'd like to draw on?
I have something. So this was a great sort of flow of thoughts and stories, I felt. And there were two things I wanted to pick up and just connect to something that I didn't have time to share in the few minutes I had at the beginning. But Bhavya talked about challenging the knowledge system, and Kate, you talked about the focus on carbon in the RED debate, right? And that is something I think, at least I've been thinking about for a very long time. And in my previous role, I was with the German Heinrich Böll Foundation. We published on that as well. We did a publication called Carbon Metrics and Ecological Epistemicide. And that was a great adventure to do that publication, working with someone from Brazil who's been really looking at carbon trading and offsetting and forests and land use, and someone who's researched the history of GDP accounting and looking at the history of colonialism and GDP accounting and how that came about. And then we got them to work together on a joint publication looking at how did we end up just talking about carbon when it comes to climate, and what does that do with us? And they went all the way back to looking at, when did we start quantifying everything, including ourselves? And, how do we set up different metric systems? And what's the power of the carbon metric system? And how does that actually kill other knowledge systems and push them to the side and actually kill them in the course of that? And some of that just recently has come up for me again in the work around the IPCC, but also in my work pushing back against geoengineering, where we're constantly struggling to claim space in terms of knowledge. So the question of whose expertise matters, who's an expert on a specific topic. So for geoengineering, usually we end up with a situation where the only experts are the ones researching the technologies, who are usually engineers who have a vested interest in further research and development of those technologies. But they are the ones who are considered experts, not the local communities impacted by these outdoor experiments, for example, but who have deep knowledge of the ecological systems that they protect and that they live from. And that is the kind of expertise that we actually need to talk about these technologies. And within the IPCC, the challenge was slightly different. You said, Lindsey, the scientists really did their best to uphold those, and that strong language. Yes, and also within amongst the IPCC authors, we have a lot of economists who are trained as neoclassical economists, and who are stuck in that frame, and who were defending that frame and putting us onto a path of, overshoot and, impossibility of system change, because that just doesn't fit into that frame. And that is the only kind of knowledge that seems to count in the IPCC Working Group 3 that looks at mitigation pathways, and that is a huge problem. So this question of, whose expertise matters, what kind of knowledge counts, and how do we diversify and, redistribute power when it comes to knowledge, and what kind of metrics do we use, is a really key one. So I see that coming strongly through some of your interventions as well.
Would anyone like to pick up on that? And Bhavya, also, I just want you to interrupt if you want to come in, because I can't actually see if you want to speak. But Gina, I think you were shaking your head.
Yeah, no, I think I want to build up on the last part that Lili said, and also bringing the feminist analysis, and is how throughout history, how throughout the different resistance struggles of grassroots, Black, Indigenous, and women of colors, different forms of feminism, even they call it themselves feminists or not, it's not the discussion but it's about that redistribution of power, asking out who owns what, who accesses what, who is leading that narrative, how it has been built up upon all those imaginaries and upon all those narratives that have been so embedded in this colonial capitalist system to perpetuate that narrative, to keep on going to the status quo. And when we reflect that discussions about power, we can understand a little bit deeper the forces behind this type of new narratives around dangerous destructions, such as, for example, the case of solar radiation management, of geoengineering, of all these things. And when we look into the forces behind those technofixes, those dangerous destructions, we are going to see personalities, we're going to see minds, elites, and if I might say, a kind of usual pattern of the wide, old, patriarchal structures behind that, to perpetuate that elitist status quo, either in a system or in another one, and that are coming to this space, normalizing somehow the narrative, being very quiet in the way that they are doing, but perpetuating the same system. So by building up a narrative that comes into these spaces, into those political powers, and that resonates with other profit interests in this space. And this is something that as well, we need to fight this corporate capture in all the different instances. It's not only in terms of the negotiation rules, but what is about happening in climate finance? What is, when we are talking about loss and damage fund, what is happening there? No, the privates are coming here like, yeah, you can go, also raising the hand is like, no, understanding the who, reflecting really on the who is owning space, dialogue, narratives, right? And reframing what we are valuing, no? I think it's interesting to see, for example, some other movements coming up as well, such as degrowth, thinking about other alternatives to shift, this economic system in a way, not only with what we have, how we can see these post-capitalist imaginaries coming into reality by listening to the different struggles that have been already paved by the different evidence and examples from Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, encompassing to the south as our new horizon.
And horizon, expanding our horizons, and value. What do we value? And quantifying ourselves. This is very powerful. I want to also ask if the audience would like to pull out a question or come in, or if someone else from the panel, but let me just quickly go to the audience. Peniel.
Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. I'm Peniel with the American Friends Service Committee, and I had a twofold question. I in particular appreciated just the calling out again of the delusion that net zero is, and the struggle a number of us, including CSOs from the United States, have with how we are further institutionalizing that delusion into our plans, and wondering what kind of messaging do we have for the average person? Because it does sound like a feasible solution if you do not know the science, and if you do not know the reality and the track record, and if you're not aware that even the IPCC reports are kind of doctored to be more palatable. So what kind of messaging are we putting out there, and how are we mainstreaming the conversation? That's the first question. And on the Global Stocktake, so I've been sitting in on a couple of those sessions, and personally, I find it hard to see the purpose or the end goal or the impact that this 700,000 submissions, et cetera, will have. And I wonder, I would like for the panelists to reflect on the importance of engaging in that space, and the gravity of whatever they come out with at the end of the process this year.
I'm going to hold to that question because there are two of them before we move for other questions. But the first question is with net zero, when I'm talking to someone who isn't so informed about this, what is the message that I need to give them about the concerns of net zero? I want to start with that one. If anybody from the panel would like to respond.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think for me, part of the answer to that question is about always, again, pulling things back from some hypothetical data by mid-century to what needs to happen now, what needs to happen this decade. So, from a point of view of climate change, what matters most of all is how fast we cut emissions this decade. It is then also important to think about when we get to zero, but the most important thing is how quick can we exit this space of immense climate harm that we're in at the moment, where emissions are at historic highs and climate harm is escalating at the greatest rates we've ever seen. So I would personally always pull back to sort of, we're currently in the space of greatest harm. How do we exit that space first now, and then we can think about sort of what happens in the long term. But what happens in the long term in hitting net zero is meaningless unless we take rapid action now.
Thank you, Neil. Kate, and then Lili.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add something on this as well. I think the short-term action and the need to phase out fossil fuel and land use change emissions this decade, and that came clearly out of the IPCC synthesis report, which is helpful. What I find in terms of sort of talking to people or getting people to understand the problems with net zero, it's amazing, like you talk to policymakers or people embedded in this process or who know the science, and you get into this very convoluted discussion and it goes in circles and you sort of can't agree anything. But then I talk to my neighbour who knows nothing about this, and I say, so the plan is that we can keep burning coal as long as we plant more trees. And they say, well, that's crazy. So I think sort of also bringing it down to that level, it just doesn't work, it doesn't make sense. And so then what's the alternative? Obviously we need to stop burning coal, phase down and out gas, and it's more about the zero than the net, as I said before.
I have a different response to that, and because you asked about, you said you're based in the US, I understand, and a lot of my colleagues are at the Center for International Environmental Law, and the way that net zero manifests in the US right now has a lot to do with carbon management, right? It's all about carbon management, and I think what is really powerful and really important is to explain to people and show what a carbon management industry and society and economy actually looks like, the scale of that and the implications of that. So I myself, I've spent a bit of time in Cancer Alley in Texas, in Louisiana, really looking at what this looks like already, the oil and gas production, the plastic and fertilizer, facilities and the pipelines and everything. And I think that is what we have to keep in mind. Like, we're adding to, we already have, communities highly impacted by pollution, usually Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color communities, economically marginalized communities, and we're adding to that pollution. We're not just locking in that pollution, we're adding to that pollution. And one of the things that I've sort of learned from those communities is that they don't talk about the life cycle of petrochemicals, they talk about the death march of petrochemicals. And I think that is really important. And, just showing how fossil fuels along the entire death march have impacts on not just on the climate, but also on our health, on human rights, on social justice, how fossil fuels are racist. Just all of those dimensions, and then explaining, okay, that is the economy we're locking in, and we're adding more pipelines, we're adding more, injection wells, we're adding more risk and more harm for those communities. And that is the proposition with carbon management, and that is built into net zero. So just telling some of those stories, I think, is really, really important.
Neil.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of build on that. Something I was thinking about as I was hearing all the other speakers is, the relationship between truth and imagination. And I think your point, Lili, is so important that actually, I think often, net zero as a phrase sounds sort of innocuous, but if we actually try and imagine the futures that we're talking about, again, Gina, when you were talking about the sort of imagination which is facilitated in a room where you have a very non-diverse set of experts, actually you get a future which is so unimaginative, and it doesn't represent the immense power of human creativity and imagination. And so I think, actually that's something I'm going to be taking from this, is trying more and more when I think about numbers and systems to think, well, what imagination is being held here, and is this really representative of the amazing strength and imagination and creativity that is in humanity?
Could I just move to your global stocktake question, Peniel? Really, the question is the value. What do we want out of this that would help us move forward? And I wondered if anybody from the audience would like to add to that, or within the panel. What would be your hope for the value of the global stocktake? Okay.
Yeah, so I've been following the global stocktake closely here, and I have some strong opinions on it. The first is that I hear a lot from people, the global stocktake is sort of meaningless, it's this talk shop, we've got all this input and it's not going to go anywhere. And I think that's, I don't think, and a lot of people sort of saying, the outcome's not going to be that meaningful, therefore. And it's not, we can't think of it in that way. I think to some degree it's by design to try and take the power out of the global stocktake. So we shouldn't be accepting that and dismissing it as a process. When the Paris Agreement was agreed, one of the most important element of it really was the global stocktake in terms of ratcheting ambition and the way that was based on science and equity. And then, so we need to not, we need to hold governments to account to delivering a meaningful global stocktake. So that's the first point. And then the second is sort of really separating out the technical dialogue from the political outcome. And if you follow both in the negotiations, you see that they're quite different, obviously. And in terms of the political outcome, there's a lot of disagreement there on what it should cover. The technical dialogue, I think, it comes with a synthesis report. That's what I was going to say. I think we need to see the technical dialogue as the process rather than the outcome. So it was the process of that dialogue and that engagement and what people did that was valuable. And there'll be a synthesis report, and, it's not really a big deal, probably, politically. The political outcome, there's a lot at stake, and there is a real disagreement between whether it should include how we got here as opposed to just where we are and what we're going to do next. And so how we got here is the historical dimension. It draws in some of the colonialism and the injustices of the past, in particular in terms of historical emissions, and that needs to be part of our taking stock of where we are. Otherwise, it's completely inequitable. It's like erasing history to start from now and just look forward in the global stocktake. So I think that's the key conversation now that's in stake in terms of the political outcome.
Thank you. Gina, did you want to? And then I want to turn to the audience and ask you to share a story. Gina.
Yeah, I just want to kind of trigger when you say the GST, when it was kind of conceived as well and thought as reaching the ambition. And for me, with the conversation that we're having about truth, climate action and so on, and the injustices, the context, I was thinking about what is then that ambition, or how that ambition is framed, in the sense of an ambition that is still in a system moving toward that concept, and I bring back to the concept of growth. Right? So it's how that ambition is nurturing that notion of growth, of that notion of important development. So when we are nurturing into that process, how are we going to do this shift, systemic change that we need? How are we going to crack down those root causes when our ambition is to keep nurturing that same nucleus? I hope you follow me, right? So that's why we also need to link what we are doing here with other different discussions happening currently. Because otherwise then we're just going to be kind of running in circles, like to fulfill that ambition, but that ambition is not real. It's for example, when we're talking about just transition, what's the just part of the transition? When we talk about just transition, is not moving from a male-dominated work, like labor sector, to another male-dominated sector, but changing the raw material. Rather, how we then conceiving that ambition out of that nucleus of infinite growth and infinite material and energy use and resources. So can we reach that? Yeah.
And let's hope the global stocktake embraces that, because it needs to be heard. And Kay talked about the harm and the hurt in the room. I really would love to hear a story from the audience, something that you feel is more truthful, or a way forward, or a story of your experience of engaging in this. It could be a positive, it could be a frustration. I'd love to give the audience a space here. Please don't feel too shy.
Apology for being late. I was in another meeting, unfortunately. I want to reply on the comment on IPCC Working Group 3, since I was a lead author in IR6, and I agree with the comment. I'm in particular coming from the energy and the mitigation part. And the paradigm is to push technology solutions to improve efficiency. And we know that is good, but has some limitation, because you can have wonderful electric vehicles that is huge and still consume a lot. And maybe you're just driving that to take the kids to the school. So we struggle to introduce the concept of energy sufficiency. It means giving enough energy for the well-being of all humanity, and so some limitation to to the size of the house. If you really need a car, if you can change your lifestyle. And there was also a chapter on energy demand which went in that direction, but it truly is not yet reflecting the SPM, and is the SPM are still driven by technologies, investment, economic consideration, rather than equity and social justice and alignment, full alignment with SDGs. So I think the new cycle should really focus on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that. We fought to get sufficiency mentioned and even it defined in the summary. because it wasn't in there, and it was such a profound concept there. And I was even pushing and encouraging, could we have a special report on sustainable and just economic systems? Because that's the piece that's not there. We have land, we have 1.5, but can we move forward on what the mitigation report started and develop it further, but in line with a wider understanding of what economics is or can be? Thank you so much. Another story.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Ola Okot. I'm from Uganda, where I work with the National Youth Council. It has been an amazing flow, like Lil, my fellow lawyer, tried to talk. You're not a lawyer? Okay, yeah, it's just, sorry for the assumption. But it was a really good flow of, panelists, and I love the different kinds of energy. I had a discussion with my neighbor, and she was telling me about, what people, especially on the western side. I come from Uganda. I don't like to genderize or use terms like Global South, but yeah, somewhere there in Africa, and it's a different conversation, That side, it's not, can you give up flights? Can you give up, these consumerisms? It's more, can we survive? And sometimes people, in my neighborhood, these places are cutting down trees, for energy. Then the story that the government, for example, if you follow the EACOP issue that we have, construction of a pipeline in Uganda. So the story being sold is along those lines, like our people need to survive. And, and the people are rallying behind that, because a lot of people, of course there are those that disagree, but a lot of people are rallying behind that kind of story. So I like that the panel kind of brought out the importance of agenda setting and putting a story behind that, having some data behind that. It's really important. And also diversity of panels. Neil tried to comment on that, because then you have, the energy here is more like, what can we tone down? And the other side, it's how can we survive? So those two need to meet somewhere. Spaces, resources to keep learning. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing the how do we survive and the reminder of where we start in supporting those most affected right now. And what do we need to do to make sure that those people don't multiply dramatically, because we can act now. And that's the ethical. Another story, another sharing, another hope. Yes.
Thank you. Hello, I am Bir. I am from HD Fourth World, and maybe my story is going to be more local, because I feel like also sometimes here we get into such abstract questions and discussions that we feel like we get lost in the words. But just a little success story. In the next months, there's we have a team in Brussels, ATD Fourth World. We work with people living in extreme poverty, and we have a good relationship with the Just Transition Ministry, or ecological, I don't know exactly the term they have, that we've built throughout the years, and that we've managed to let them know that there's people living in poverty in Brussels, and that they are already suffering the consequences of climate change in Brussels. And for the next months, they are going to participate in a whole process of consultation. So a group of people living in poverty, together with some people from the ministry, to decide on pathways on how these people are going to be included in the just transition in Belgium. And just to say that when we do push, when we do tell stories, when we do put the people forward, at some point, sometimes we win allies, and we win little steps in which the real people, the people who are suffering, the people who have the experience, are taken into account in the solutions. So sometimes it's true that in big fora like this, it's difficult to imagine, and we're still far from having a real participation of the people most concerned, but at some point, we're getting there. So just to give a little bit of a win-win story.
Thank you. And I also want to highlight that your organization has put out a remarkable report on extreme poverty and ways forward. And I would just highlight, go and ask her for her website, because it's a turning point for me. I was very impressed. Any other stories before we ask for a last? Any suggestions? Any last question? Then I'd just like a reflection from our panelists before we end, and to say, while you're here in the last few minutes, please write something on your Post-it. And as you go out, you can grab publications, but put your Post-it on the glass on the outside so we can collect. And just a reflection, I'm going to start with Bhavya. Bhavya, you've been very patient, but I want to start with you before we finish. Thank you.
Yeah, it was indeed a very interactive session. I think we learned a lot from the stories that we heard from the audience. I want to add into some of the discussions that came up where I was like listening and reflecting what I have heard from the field. I think one story, and I want to like end with that. So it was like I was working in a protected area, which is in the Tamil Nadu, the south part of India. And then the person who was with me, he's a Kurumba indigenous person. So he was talking about his landscape. And he's showing that the plantation, which is a eucalyptus, which is inside the protected area, and saying that it wasn't like this before like 10 years back. And the discussion or the decision that was made to put up that plantation in there instead of, in the place of the native forest wasn't even like consultative. And I mean, like, I want to like highlight that incident and talk about the carbon effects and the carbon offsets that we talk, where the biodiversity is not taken into account. The cultural spaces are not taken into account. So that's a big question, when you're speaking of the ethical global stocktake, where are these concerns taken into account, and where are these voices heard? And I think there was an audience who just spoke about that there is obviously a chance to go ahead and make some changes and make people's voices heard. But I believe where we are living in, with so much of complexities and the differences, I do have hope that things will change, but I haven't kind of ask this out in an open forum, that how do we make these voices heard? So how do we make these anecdotes, which doesn't have validation, which in terms of climate change language, but how do we make the simple anecdotes, incidences more stronger and bring it up to create more ethical spaces for the climate change discourse? So with that, I end. Thanks.
Thank you, Bhavya. That's beautiful. And any other reflections before we finish from our panelists?
I think one of my reflections on today's event, which I've really enjoyed and found really helpful, is that Truthful Climate Action is about telling the truth of grief as well as the truth of hope. So, that we live in a world of profound loss, and we're in that now, and we need to tell that story and that truth. But also we live in a world where there is still the capacity for radical change, and 1.5 degrees can still be, we can still limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And I think we've heard today some of both those stories of grief, the truth of grief and the truth of hope. And I hope that we can hold those two together.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up briefly on what was mentioned around degrowth and around overconsumption. And in terms of ending deforestation and land use change, which I think is really important, it is overconsumption and growth that's driving that. It's expansion of industrial agriculture, mining, extraction of other resources. So it's really a big part of the story, but also that it's important we frame this in terms of overconsumption is what needs to be tackled, and unsustainable consumption. And there are many countries, as we heard, where consumption will need to increase, and living standards and resource use needs to increase, so that it has to be a convergence to a sustainable or sufficiency, as Lindsey talked about.
Yeah, I will add, maybe not doing a reflection, but doing an invitation. It's an invitation on an action that is going to be happening today at 2 p.m. in the corridor, like where the stairs are in the corridor. And it's an action that is linked to this conversation in a way that it's an action in solidarity with those that have been defending the truth, with those that have been imprisoned by defending the truth, with those that have been silenced for defending that truth. So I would like to invite you all to this space. We are going to have a strong action where we are going to be sharing poems, where we are going to be sharing some letters, where we are going to be sharing those stories of folks, comrades that have been silent and that are still giving the fight in a cell, in a tiny room, or in different corners of the world. So do please join us at 2 in the corridor there. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you at 2. Thank you.